Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Stephanie Sandala. I am programming and outreach specialist here at Library Link NJ, and I'm so thrilled for this author visit. We have a great lineup of authors for you, and we have our lovely moderator, as always, Christy Chadwick, who will introduce everyone and get us started. And as we go along, please feel free to put your name in the chat and which library you're from. We're always happy to have you. Christy, please go ahead and get us started.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie. Welcome, everyone. It's great to be back again with you this week. And for those who may not know who I am, I'm Christy Chadwick. I'm the director of the Ballston Community Public Library in Burnt Hills, New York. And I am so thrilled to be joined by my panel this week. We'll start off with Huda Fahmy. Huda taught English to middle and high schoolers before she started writing about her own experiences as a visibly Muslim woman in America, and was encouraged by her older sister to turn these stories into comics. Huda currently resides in Houston with her husband and son. Pedro Martín is the award-winning creator of Mexikid, based on his online comic series of the same name. He continues to chronicle his life growing up Mexican-American in a series called Mexikid Stories. A former Hallmark artist, Pedro lives with his wife in Kansas City, Missouri. Kirk Reedstrom has spent most of his adult life surrounded by books, and we'll ask about your childhood later. He currently works in a public library, yay, and used to be a bookseller at the Blue Willow Bookshop, an independent bookstore in Houston, Texas. He likes to develop characters with a lot of heart and a little bit of mayhem. And a third-generation Japanese-American, Debbi Michiko Florence, is the acclaimed author of more than 20 books for children and tweens, including the author of the award-winning Jasmine Toguchi series. A native Californian, Debbi now lives in Connecticut. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's so great to see you. All right, so let's jump right into this. I always like to ask all of our authors and creators, when did you realize that you were going to be an author or an author illustrator? Or maybe you started as an illustrator. I'll get to hear about that a little bit more. And what started your love for creating art and stories? Pedro, let's start with you.
Oh, wake up, Pedro. You too. I honestly, my wife says I stumble into everything, and so becoming an author was a huge stumble into kind of event. I used to be an illustrator for Hallmark cards. I used to be a greeting card artist, and during that little free time that I used to have a lot of free time, but during my free time, I would write these little stories about my family on these little 3x5 cards because they were just everywhere. And so I would just write these little stories, tie them together with rubber bands, and put them in this Batman lunchbox that I have. And when I retired, like 27 years later, and I was unpacking, I was here in this basement unpacking, I found that lunchbox and I opened it up and I was like, oh, I used to love writing these stories. And so I just decided I'm going to go ahead and just put them online. So I started rewriting them and putting them online, and I had the best time. That was the thing. Like, coming from a corporate environment that tended to, press you down and push you into a mold, this was like the most personal thing that could ever have happened to me. So I was really, really in my happiness. And so I did that for a couple years, a new story every week. And then after about 2 years, my wife and I agreed that I should probably make some money doing what I'm doing. And so I tried to kind of sell this idea of putting these comics together as a compilation with kind of these stories in between that would link all the stories as one big memoir. And nobody wanted it. Like, everybody I showed to was like, no, thank you, we don't understand you. Like, this away. So it wasn't until I finally met up with an agent who said, oh yeah, nobody will want that. There's no place for that in the world. But he said he liked what I was doing, and he thought one of the story bits that I had written about was interesting. And it was actually like 2 sentences at the bottom of the page that said, like, my family took a road trip to Mexico to get my grandfather. Things get dark, and I don't want to talk about it. And he's like, oh, tell me that story. And I'm like, well, here, the strip is the story. And then he's like, no, we need it, something that we can sell to the kids. That sounded wrong, but he was just saying like we needed it in a bigger story form with, with a middle grade point of view, because that's where the readers are. And so that kind of like set me on this whole kind of road trip to develop this story as a book. And so I spent the next 2 years kind of working that out and stuff. And so that's how I became an author illustrator, and I didn't intend to. So that's kind of my story.
Awesome. Huda, why don't you go ahead?
We actually share an editor, Pedro and I.
Yes.
And I don't know who it was that told me, but I don't know if it was her or somebody else, but they were like, you actually wrote like 600 pages
Oh,
of novel, and they had to like edit it down. I was like, that's amazing. I would 100% read 600 pages of Mexican. Like,
well, I mean, I don't want to interrupt you, but that was how little I knew about what I was doing, was that I didn't know when to stop. And so I just turned in 640 pages, and they're like, no, cut that in half. I had already drawn 640 pages, and so they just said, stop that now. But thank you.
well, I mean, I love your work, and I've been following you since before. Like, I think when you first started, and I immediately started following you, and I've loved it ever since.
Oh,
For me, I was 5 years old. I knew immediately I wanted to be a writer. I was like, Mom, they're like, what do you want to be? I said, I want to be a writer. And they're like, that's not how you say doctor. And I'm a first generation. They're like, no, you can do that as a hobby, but where's the money? That's not going to get you money. But they had said something. They said you have to be really good to be a successful writer, essentially telling me that I was never going to be that good. And for years, that put me in the biggest writer's block. I couldn't start something and finish it. I just could never finish something. I would always be stuck because I had this fear that I would just never be good enough to find this ending. And I was obsessed with being perfect. The story had to be perfect. So I just kind of never did it, but I always like danced around this idea of wanting to be a writer, and I majored in English and I taught English, and I thought that was the closest that I would get to writing a story, is teaching other kids to write and analyze stories. But I've been in love with comics. I didn't speak English right away, and my parents were very worried that we were just not going to assimilate before they realized, oh, backtrack, we got to get we got to make sure they love their culture and their language. But before that, those like really important years of where you're learning your language were completely just like, you need to speak English. You can't speak Arabic anymore. And I learned to speak English with comic books, and I fell in love. And I was, it was Garfield and The Far Side and Calvin and Hobbes, and that's what I was obsessed with. And to the point where I would even write my essays in college about analyzing comic strips. And did I know how to draw? No, not very well. It was all stick figures and really like anime eye, the one eye only, because I could never get the other eye to look perfect. Oh, it's just a one anime eye with like hair covering the other eye, or where the other eye would be. And then, and I was teaching English, and I got married. I moved to Texas, and I had my first son, and it was then that I decided to step away from teaching and start kind of writing my own stories. And I also started with a memoir. And it was written out, and as Pedro said, nobody wants a memoir. They're like, unless you're like super famous, nobody's going to read your memoir. And so my sister was like, hey, can you take one of your stories? And they were all short essays, and can you like draw it out for me, even though she knew I didn't really draw. And so I was like, sure. And I've loved comics ever since. And why don't I do this for all of these short stories? And so I started doing that. And if you ever go back all the way back to the very first comics that I posted, they're stick figures. And I just kind of posted anyway, because I had these stories of what it felt like to be a Muslim. And it was at the time that Trump was elected and the Muslim ban was happening. And there were a lot of stories that were out there that weren't reflective of what my lived experience was, and the lived experience of many Muslim Americans. So I thought, let me tell that part of my life. And the feeling of being an outsider was such a one that people could relate to as a universal experience. Even though it was to me, I thought it was such a specific story, a hijabi, a covered girl who loved her religion and still felt like an outsider and was really just trying to find herself. And it touched so many people. And that surprised me so much. I could not ever believe that my story could reach so many people. And then I found my agent, who was like, was also the one who kind of encouraged me to touch on this specific YA story of fitting in or having this identity crisis, or as a teenager. And that's kind of how it just kind of blossomed.
Thank
Sorry, I
you.
talked fast. I know there's a lot to
No,
say.
no.
I want to
No,
make
that's
sure it's
beautiful.
slow.
I totally appreciate the not being able to draw things and figuring out the tricks of how not to show those things you can't draw. You know, it's like tall grass, you know, it's just like hiding behind a
Oh,
curtain.
she doesn't have a neck and hands. Her hands.
Yeah. I would do mittens for everything. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Definitely. Kirk, how about you?
Yeah. Well, also my handwriting was so bad when I was growing up. My parents were convinced I was going to be a doctor, but I
No.
proved them wrong. So from the earliest age I can remember, I loved storytelling, and writing and drawing was never separate for me. It was always the same thing. And I've always liked to tell kids I was never the best drawer in any of my classes. I like Elliot Gerson in the first grade was the best because he could draw eagles really well. But I never stopped. I never stopped, and I really wanted to be Bill Watterson or Chuck Jones. And I just like Huda, I loved newspaper comics. I wasn't a big Marvel and DC person. I've come around to them. Like, I'm not afraid to read a Batman comic anymore, but I loved Calvin and Hobbes and Peanuts and Boondocks and Kathy. I even read the soap opera comics.
Oh.
I felt like really sophisticated as a 7-year-old. uh, and the first book I made was when I was about 6 years old. I did a Sonic the Hedgehog fanzine. And then I thought I would want to go into animation. I also loved music. I played the violin and the bass guitar, and I couldn't decide between doing music or art. And so I decided to choose both, and I went to a tiny liberal arts college where you never have to make a decision about what you want to major in. And I William Joyce was the resident artist there. So if you all remember like Roly Polioli and Meet the Robinsons, he was just starting Moonbot Studios when I was there, and I managed to weasel my way into an internship with him to see how animation worked. I realized I really wanted to work on my own stories. I moved back to Houston because of some family illnesses. I worked in the tech world for a little while where I argued for hours about where a button should go on a website. And then my parents said, why don't you try working at our little neighborhood bookstore? And that was Blue Willow Bookshop. And it's like, if you all have seen You Got Mail, it's like the store from You Got Mail. It's a tiny little store, but Valerie Kaler, the owner, was on the advisory board of the American Booksellers Association. They do 300 to 400 author events every year. So I fell in love with children's literature. I got to meet so many of my favorite heroes, and that's when I started really trying to pursue writing and illustrating. And then a mere 10 years later, I signed with my agent. We sent out a picture book version of Duck and Moose. And in fact, I didn't do comics. I thought I would try to do watercolor. It was a picture book version of Duck and Moose, of the first one of Duck Moves In. Nobody wanted it. Nobody wanted to touch it. We sent out a completely different book to Disney, and they did not want that book either. But they said, "Oh, we think Kirk is pretty funny. Have you considered? Do you have anything else?" And we said, "Of course we have other things. We'll send you everything." And the picture book version of Duck and Moose was in there, and they said, "Have you considered turning this into a graphic novel?" And I said, course I have. I'm so glad you asked. Give me 2 weeks and I'll see what I can do. And they said, "Oh, this is pretty funny. Do you have other ideas for stories with the characters?" I was like, "Of course I do. Give me another 2 weeks and we'll see what happens." I ended up changing my style like 4 times. And in fact, I started using a dip pen because I like making life hard on myself, but I wanted the comics to look like a little bit more like the newspaper comics that I liked. And I also wanted to, when I was a younger artist, I wanted my work to be really resplendent, really lovely watercolor stuff. And when I went with comics, I realized I could actually have fun making the art that I make. And so I let myself get a little like wonkier with the line work. And that's the end of my story now. We have Duck and Moose on the shelves.
That's wonderful. Yes, applause all around. Awesome. And Debbie, tell us a little bit about your story getting into your stories.
Well, it's kind of fun that all of us were talking about 5, 6 years old, because that's kind of where it started for me as well. My dad read to me as a child all the, what was that? Flocks and Socks, the tongue twister one. Was that the tongue twister? I made him read it to me over and over because it cracked me up to see my dad trip over the words. But after a while, he got really good at it, and it wasn't as entertaining. So go dog go. And my mom took us, my sister and I, to the library regularly, and we were allowed to get whatever books whatever we wanted, but we had to carry them, and we had to walk, like, I don't know, it was like 10 blocks. And so I'd always be the one with a big stack of books, and I'd be dropping them, and I'd have to pick them up in a big bag. But I think that's where I fell in love with stories and books and libraries. And then when I was 6 years old, I started writing stories and drawing pictures. I'm the outlier here. I am not an illustrator, but back then I loved to do both. And in fact, I share that very first story during my school visits, which is not a very interesting story. And the pictures are hard to tell what they are, but I always tell the kids, I had fun. That's important. You just had fun. But I was kind of a closet writer. I continued reading books and writing stories, but only for myself. I never shared them with anybody. They were all for myself. By high school, I was writing like romance stories with, Japanese American main characters, because you didn't see Japanese American main characters falling in love or having crushes. And I didn't really think that would be a path for me. And, my parents, I'm third generation, but my parents were still held very closely to first generation ideals. I'm like, doctor, lawyer. And I said, veterinarian, that's kind of close to doctor, because I loved animals. So I went to college and I got my degree in zoology, and a minor in English. And all my English classes I did really well in, and I was not doing well in those science classes. And very quickly I thought, I don't think I'm going to be a veterinarian. But I did end up going back to get my teacher's certificate. And I ended up working as an educator at a zoo, the Detroit Zoo. And I really enjoyed it, but I was still writing stories, not sharing them with anybody. And it wasn't until I met my husband and his job took us to Mexico City, and we had to move, that I couldn't keep my job. Obviously, they weren't going to let me do that remotely. So I had to think about, what else do I love doing? And that was when I said, well, I love writing stories. I have this opportunity. I can't work in Mexico. I don't have a visa. So maybe I will pursue a career in writing for young people, because all those books that I read when I was young, those were the books that I still hung on to. And I thought, what a joy it would be to write for younger readers. And that's how it started. And 15 years of rejections, I sold my first book, and that's how it all started.
Wow, that's
Oh,
great.
wonderful.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think we all have our origin stories. You guys are superheroes to us. So we always love to hear about this. So thank you. Huda, you are sharing the Muslim American experience and Muslim experience with the world. And it's like opening yourself up to observation, obviously. It's pretty obvious that your Huda F series is a reflection of yourself. So what made you decide to kind of really write about your own life versus a completely fictional character?
So I always have to make sure I'd say that it's a Muslim experience. It's just really one Muslim experience, to make sure that people understand there are so many Muslim experiences. And at the time when I started Huda FRU, I had already been posting online my webcomic series. It's called Yes, I'm Hot in This. And that's the one where I had, based a lot of the characters' experiences on, the microaggressions or the full out aggressions. I don't know what the opposite of it, but that my character, myself, that I would experience in real life, along with stories that friends would tell me, along with headlines, and that those were just kind of, and then I would process these thoughts and these emotions with humor. And that's kind of just how I've always experienced or processed trauma is just by laughing about it. And so when I started writing, oh, and then the next book after Yes, I'm Hot, and I just compiled those into a book that was Yes, I'm Hot in This, and then the book after that was That Can Be Arranged, and that one is a full-on autobiography, and that's how I met my husband, and it's really about just how I really grew to love myself and understanding myself before I started to before I decided to get married. So when I wrote Huda For You, I didn't want her to be based completely on me because I found that to be very limiting, but it was an experience that I had that I knew other young people were experiencing, and that was just identity and not knowing where they fit in. And specifically just if you know, are a Muslim and you don't feel like you fit in because of your religion, but then you also feel like you're limited to your religion and that you can only fit in with other Muslims, but then you realize you don't fit in with other Muslims. And it became this really universal story that you can't even fit in with your own people that you feel like are supposed to be your people. And I was trying to really kind of separate myself from the character so that I could give her more freedom to do what she wanted to do, and not be limited to like people being like, oh, did that really happen to you? Did you really did that, you know? And at the same time, I found that when I'd be like, oh, no, that specific thing didn't happen to me, but, you know, I feel like I had to defend that it was still a valid story because I had to prove that, hey, this still does happen to other kids, but it didn't really happen to me. And I found I trapped myself. It was a really, I really feel like I dug a grave. And it's just, there's a lot. It's complicated, but so it's like I'm kind of stuck because yes, she's named after me because I feel like my mother and my father gave me such a funny name and with the initials that I have, and so I thought I have to capitalize on this somehow, but then I'm stuck now. So there's all this like stuff that I have to think about when I'm writing my character, and it's just, you know, it's just one of those, another thing that I have to think about when I'm writing. And I hope I answered the question because I've actually forgotten the question.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
The question was, how old are you?
Oh,
I don't know where you went.
okay.
That's wild where you took that one.
Darn, it took a turn. It took a turn.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So speaking of personal experience,
Go.
Pedro, we're going to talk about yours a little bit. Mexikid is about your own experience. You mentioned a family trip to Mexico to bring your grandfather back to the US in an already very full home, as you mentioned. So why was it important to kind of like really expand this particular story about your grandfather? Because you said that it was like a couple of sentences and then it became 640 pages. So tell us more about how that happened and why this particular one was able to do that.
Well, yeah, and actually I had this story in my back pocket for a long time, and I really wanted to write about it in the series. But every time I kind of approached it, I'm like, this is kind of like too big to really go into, and I didn't want to like break it up week by week because I didn't think anyone would follow it. And I was like, well, I can't really build up momentum to it. So I'm like, I'm just going to kind of put it in the back pocket. But when I did get the chance to do something bigger with it, it went through a whole bunch of phases internally where I was originally, it was really just supposed to be a humor, just a funny road trip about boogers and, you know, sudden diarrhea and deer surgery and just like these hilarious moments. But I was kind of like thinking about what was important to myself and to my family. I kept going back to this story about my grandfather's legacy and all the stuff I had heard about him through all these years, and all the stuff I heard about him on the trip, made me kind of feel like I was the recipient and I was the beneficiary of just this life and lives that went before me that were tragic and, you know, poor and full of struggle, and also that I could sit in this basement and draw cartoons. Like it was just beyond me to understand. Like I had to put my brain around all of that information and all those feelings and all those lives, you know, that came before me. And so that kind of took on a whole different feel for me when I started to write the book. It's like, yeah, I had to really like go back to myself as a child, think about the trip, and then think about all the implications that my grandfather was responsible for. You know, my grandfather was responsible for my father and their migration to the United States and everything. So he became in that way, he became more and more of a superhero to me. So he became more important than he probably thought he was. And so I use that story to kind of explain that thought process this kid was going through in the more actual superhero terminologies, saying like he was a fighter and he was a this and he was a that, but in the big picture, he was the reason I'm here today. And so I had to like honor that struggle and everything, and then hopefully that any struggle that I have gone through, which I have not gone through so much, any struggle that I have gone through will benefit the next person. And so I just kind of wanted to point that out to the reader that this you are who you come from. You might not know who you come from or where you come from, but the act of discovery is also part of what they're giving you. So me going back and looking at what they did for me is also a gift to me, just the exploration, because every time I hear a story or every time I look into something, I feel like I'm growing more, even at this old age. I'm growing more and I'm learning more and I'm being able to express more because of all of that. And so whenever I tell kids, and I know this is like a real first, second generation conundrum that kids have, that they're like, oh, I'm neither this or that. Like, I'm not Mexican, I'm not American, I'm something in between. I'm like, no, what you are is a continuum. You're you're the next evolution, the next, the next big thing that comes from that amazing collaboration between these two cultures. And so this is great. You're actually in a great position so that you can be more. And then the next person that comes from you is going to even be bigger than that. So my grandfather, so when I was writing the story, that's what I got from personally from telling that story about my grandfather, is that all that. And I hoped that being able to tell that story will get that into the kids' heads and maybe make them think about like where they came from and give them the itch to kind of look into their family's past and maybe build on it. So, and I'm
Great. Yeah.
50 something years old. I can't remember now.
I'm 50 something years old too, so
Yeah,
it's
there we
okay.
go.
So Pedro, Huda, both of you, obviously you have written about, tying in your personal experience to these. So that also brings along your family at times. And I want to know, and I'm sure everybody else does too, what do your families think about what you have produced so far? Huda, let's start with you.
There's a character in the books who is an outline, and we call the mysterious one, and that a lot of people ask about her. Maybe she might be, after Huda, the one that is asked about the most. And she wasn't always an outline. When I let my sisters read the book before I even came out, I just was like my sketches, my drawings, and that sister is loosely, very, very loosely based off, said no. Like, no, she's very private. She's very private. And so she was just like, her name wasn't even the mysterious one. She was something else completely, and I don't even remember what. But she was just like, no, I don't want that in there. I don't want to be in there. I'm take me out. And I was like, well, fine. So this is a made up character. She's not you at all. And she's gonna be called the mysterious one. And she's just the one now that everybody asks. So kind of like backfired on her. But no, but she's a huge fan. My sisters are all like, well, I thought they were all fans. I'm gonna tell you this, but then one of them just revealed to me, she's like, no, I don't read your books because I started Huda FRU, and that's nothing like me. I was like, I know it's nothing like you. She's like, you made me awful. I was like, it's not you. I was like, I'm trying to let her know, and I'm just like, in fact, if I, to be honest, each of those characters, each of the sisters probably represents like one part of my own personality. So there really are, yes, I have 4 sisters, but each of those sisters represent something about myself that I kind of just was writing about. But but they really are. They're my biggest supporters. My older sister buys like 30 copies every time I publish a book and just gives them out to people. And I mean, they're wonderful. So there are some things like The next book I'm writing that is coming out next year is a very personal story. It's a divorce story. My parents did get divorced, but because they are also very private people, and even though this is fictionalized, I am not comfortable writing about like why they got divorced. So it's really going to be more about Huda and her family and her sisters processing the divorce than it is focusing on why they exactly are getting divorced. And so there's still, it does affect my writing. It does put me in a box a little bit. I don't mind because it is my family. I did do that kind of to them. So my mother loves it. She wanted to be the voice of her character in the audiobooks. I said, no, Mom, I'm sorry. Which she really loves it though. She loves the attention and it's great.
Wonderful. Pedro.
Well, I come from a big family of storytellers. All of them are storytellers, and actually, like my brother Hugo is a writer for the LA Times, so he's a story reporter, I guess. But I had texted everybody, and it's this big text chain, and I said, "This is the story I'm telling, and these are the changes I'm making to the story," because we all knew this story. We were all there, so everybody knew that. But there was like some changes that I was going to make just to fit the story. And to a person, they said, "Sounds great. Good luck to you," which in my family is, "I don't think so, you big liar." Like, it's like, they're like, whatever, that's not going to happen. But anyway, so I did it. So I said, okay, that's by law, you have nothing more to say, and I'm cutting you off here. And so I did the book. The book came out, and actually I should back up. So when I told my dad I sold the book, he got excited, and then he started calling me probably every other day at like tequila o'clock to tell me a new story. And he would like always preface the story by like how much he thinks I could sell this story for. So he'd be like, "Oh, I got a $10,000 story for you." And I'm like,
I love
"Hit me,
it.
Dad, hit me." And then he would tell me the story, and I'd be like, "Perfect." And then like 2 days later, he'd call back again, and he'd be like, "Hey, I have a $10,000 story for you." I'm like, "Okay, shoot, tell me the story." And it was the exact same story he just told 2 days before, but he changed a little bit of it. And I don't know that he remembered that he told me the story before, but he kind of like adjusted it. And I felt like, okay, if he's doing this on a daily basis, I can do this on this big project. So that's cool. So then the book comes out, and I sent him a big box of books because he said that he could sell them for $50 a pop. And I'm like, yeah, keep the change, Dad. And so I sent him, and then when I went to visit next, all the books were gone. And so I said, "Did you sell them all?" And he's like, "I mostly gave them away, but your brothers and sisters all picked them up." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, cool. Did anybody say anything?" He's like, "Nobody said anything." And then every time after that I've seen them, nobody had said anything about it at all. Like, they've all read it, or they've all seen it, or they all have a copy, but no one said anything. But my brother Hugo, out of the blue, one day calls, and he's like, "Hey, I just want to tell you like how proud I am of you, and how this is amazing, and all the accolades are just amazing. I just want to tell you how awesome this is." And I'm like, I was so stunned because we're brothers, and we've never had that kind of conversation ever. It would be like they would walk by and slap me on the back of the head, and that's love, love. And so I was just so taken aback by this phone call, I didn't know what to say. Like, I had to follow up with an email to him and go like, "Oh, I did not process any of that, so I'm just going to tell you, I thank you, and I love you too." And then he never responded to the email, which makes me like perfectly happy now.
All is right.
Everybody's cool. We're all in our own comfort zone with talking about this book, and so we're really happy about it. So I think they're all cool, and they're all really excited about the next book. So we'll see how that turns out.
So Kirk, let's move on to you. And how did Duck and Moose first come to life for you? And of course, we need to know now which family members they're based on.
Yeah. Well, it also came to me on a family trip. So in 2017, my dad, my brother, his girlfriend, my wife, and I went to Alaska. We all crammed into a van and roamed the wilderness, and we're all still a little cramped because it wasn't that big of a van. We went to Denali, and I loved it. I had been a Boy Scout and got to go once before, and was this close to becoming a river guide, but I went to classical music camp instead. So we saw all of we saw these animals. We saw moose. We saw uh tons of huskies. They have a working husky team there. So it gets so cold that the rangers will actually use huskies to get around in the winter sometimes. And I came back to Shreveport, where I live now, and thought, okay, I really want to use some of the animals that I had encountered on the trip in a book. And I wrote like 3 failed books. And then at the end of 2020, I was this close to giving up on making children's books, and I drew a happy-go-lucky duck on a confused looking moose's head and thought it was the funniest thing I had done in years. And so then I combined elements of some other books that like didn't quite work, and put together a dummy, and it worked really well, but nobody else thought it did. And I as I said, we sent it out for like a year and a half and nobody wanted it until Disney ended up picking it up. And I always thought that I was Moose, because just like Moose, the only thing I really want in the world is to be left alone. I'm an introvert's introvert. And then like halfway through writing it, I realized that I've also got a lot of duck in me. So there's just 2 different sides of me, and I am, I guess, lucky enough to have a lot of internal strife. And so they both have a lot. Like I'm not great at picking up on social cues. Love my little habits, just like Moose does. And so they're both just equal parts of me. So my family has not shown up in a book yet. I will say though that my mother was a second career pastor. She became a United Methodist pastor, and most of her sermons involved the family. So we showed up quite a bit. I'm used to having a lot of family storytelling. And it was a little weird going back home from college and having a lot of people be like, "Oh, we heard about your summer trips." We're like, "Oh, did you? Great. What did I do?" And I've lost my train of thought. But duck and moose, equal parts of me.
Well, I loved your comment about being an introvert's introvert, because obviously I think that your career path shows that, because as you said, you were a bookseller and now you're a public librarian.
Huh.
Welcome to the club. But so obviously books are a part of your life. And has that been since you were a child? You touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but kind of take us a little bit more into that and how books have really kind of evolved through your life and career with this.
Yeah. Well, so I always loved reading when I was a kid. I read pretty early on, kind of anything that I could get my hands on. The first couple of books I really remember reading and loving were John Cheska and Lane Smith's The Stinky Cheeseman and Other Fairly Stupid Tales. I loved that the characters didn't work with the narrator and wanted to do their own thing. Also, so there's a Texas book that's really a book series that's well known. It's well known in Texas, and it's called Hank the Cowdog. And so it's like an early chapter book about this cow dog named Hank who lives on a ranch. And my parents used to take me to libraries and to go see this guy. And so like he would bring out his banjo. He was like a rancher and just wrote some funny books about a dog in his retirement, I think. Maybe I'm making some stuff up, but we would go hear him play his banjo and talk about Hank, and we were a big road trip family too, and so we would always get audiobooks, and those books were so funny. The one I remember best is when Hank would always always like mysteries or something, and so there was this weird noise going on in a log, and he stuck his snout into it, and there was a bee that stung him, and like the rest of the audiobook, you kind of talk like this because his whole mouth got swollen. I loved that. And I loved Charlotte's Web. I also, as a student, now I love to read, but I hated to read anything that was assigned to me, and so I learned that I didn't want to do any kind of especially over didactic books. I also said I loved comics, loved newspaper comics, and when but I it making books didn't come to me even when I was interning with Bill. It hadn't struck me as a thing that you could do until one day one of my college friends was like, maybe I'll make illustrations for children's books. That's a thing you can do. And uh, then I knew I wanted to learn more about the industry too. So working at a bookstore, it helped see kind of how the sausage gets made. And I also wanted to see a different side of that at the public library. So it's different than being a bookseller, right? And I'm the manager of social media and digital services for county public library system. So I like to say I post the funny memes and I help everybody download their very first ebook. And so it's important to me to help support people discover their own interests and learn to love books the same way that I did. It's important to me that Duck and Moose is accessible. So even though I might use some big words, like I use karaoke and je ne sais quoi in the middle of the first book, I try to make sure it's done in an accessible way where you pick up on it pretty quickly. I hope that answered your question.
Oh, yes. Great.
Okay.
Thank you. I mean, I'm throwing these questions out, but honestly, I could just sit here and you all could talk and everybody would love it. So I just use the questions to kind of guide the conversation, and we're going to guide it right over to Debbie. So your writing spans young and middle readers, and most of them are illustrated in one form or another. But you said yourself, you don't usually do those illustrations. So
I don't ever.
Yeah, you don't ever. You're like stick figures. That was it for the first one. So do you communicate though with the people who are illustrating your book? Do you have any influence on who works on them or what actually goes into them for illustrations?
Okay, yeah, so no, I don't have any influence on who gets to illustrate my stories. And in the old days, I know editors tried really hard to keep the author and the illustrator completely separate. And I understand that in the way that, you don't want the author dictating to the illustrator, no, he's skinnier or whatever, he has a dog. So I understand that, but these days you can find anybody online on social media and have these side conversations. So for my chapter book series for Jasmine Taguchi, as I said, it took me a very long time to sell my first book, and I was just so like, oh my gosh, my dream is coming true. I'm going to have a book series, and similar to Kirk, they said, oh, we love this book. We want this to be a series. Do you have ideas for 3 more books? I'm like, yes, which I didn't, but eventually I did. You never say no, you always say yes, right? So when they started talking about an illustrator, I just was like, I have no opinion. You do you and let me know. But, when they presented Elizabeth Vukovic's work to me and told me that she had this lively style and we think it really fits Jasmine's personality, I was like, yes, sure. And, they would ask, what does Jasmine, what does she look like? Can you give us some notes for the illustrator? And I was just like, I don't know. And I used to say, because we all evolve and we all learn and we all grow, I used to say, I'm not a visual person. I can't visualize things. I'm not an artist. And in one way, it was true back then because I knew she was Japanese American and she was third grader. That's it. But more recently, I was offered a work for hire to write the text for a graphic novel. And I'm like, sure, because again, yes. And then I learned how graphic novel texts are written. And like, what? I have to tell the artist exactly what the panel is. So I learned very quickly I could be visual. I just, I have to think that way. So to answer your question, no, I don't really give input to the artist. I have never been unhappy with anything I've been shown. But my editors do allow me to see rough sketches for fact checking because the Jasmine Toguchi artist, I'm the only Japanese American, the only Asian American on that team. And so they always shared everything with me to make sure that it was culturally accurate or, not offensive. And there was this one illustration. I talk about Jasmine and she and the family roll mochi. And in my head, I knew that meant like this because they made a spherical shape. And I never went further to explain it. They roll mochi, the woman rolled the mochi. And when the sketches came to me, the illustrator lives in the Netherlands. So when the illustrations came to me, she showed the woman rolling mochi with a rolling pin, like you would a pie crust. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's not correct. I didn't explain it. And I was able to send videos and pictures and to help the artists know how it actually gets done. So that's the only input that I really give. For the picture book for Nikki Nakayama, what was thrilling is, yes, I did reach out on social media. I was so thrilled with Yuko's art. And we didn't give, my co-author and I, we didn't give her directions, but we just, we talked with her. Oh, we love the thing that they showed us. So that is the extent of what I do, because I really do want the artists, they're the expert at the art. I want them to be free to take my words and create whatever it is that comes from that.
That's terrific. And obviously, Jasmine Toguchi, your series, you have called it your heart books.
Mm.
So tell us more about this. Why are these your heart books right now?
Jasmine Toguchi, the kids always ask, what's your favorite book? And I'm like, oh, that's like asking a parent, who's your favorite kid? You have one, but you're not.
I have a list.
I have a list. I have Mochi Queen will always be special to me because it was my first book that I wrote of my own that was published. And because of that, it's my heart book. It took a long time when I first wrote it and sent it out. It's a story about a Japanese American girl who wants to do the boy job of pounding mochi instead of rolling mochi with the girls. And it all started with a newspaper article I saw about a Japanese American family in San Jose that got together for New Year's and traditionally made mochi. And I knew there was a man's job traditionally and a woman's job. And I thought, what would happen if there was a little girl in a family like that who wanted to do the boy's job? What would the family say? And at the time, I really wanted to write YA. And I thought, well, I'm not going to write that because that's obviously not a YA book. And I put it away. But Jasmine started talking to me and really wanted her story told. And I knew it was either going to be a picture book or maybe a chapter book. And boy, I really admire picture book writers because I knew that would be a whole different animal from all these novels that I've been writing. So I felt like chapter book, that's kind of, more like a short novel. So I went that direction and I wrote this chapter book. And after many revisions, I started submitting it out and collecting rejections, which I was used to by then. But I got this one particular rejection that said, oh, we're so happy for this submission. We're looking for multicultural stories. This was 2012. We're looking for multicultural stories. I really like this story. However, we feel that this story about Japanese American culture is much too narrow, and we like our chapter books to be more widely appealing. And I knew what that meant. And they were saying that only Japanese American kids would want to read this story. And so they rejected it, but it was that particular rejection that like crushed me. I was like, I don't want to write Jasmine Jones and the Cupcake Queen. You know, I really want to write this story. So I put it away and decided I'm never going to send that out again. And then in 2014, We Need Diverse Books organized and started getting the word out. And I tried again. And that's when Grace Kendall of FSG offered to buy the books. And I got to write 8 books about this Japanese American girl, about friendship and family and going to school. And yes, each book has a thread of Japanese American culture in it, but it's mostly about friendship and family. And that is how I grew up. Like I mentioned, I'm 3rd generation. So I feel very American, but Japanese culture was always a part of my life. And in fact, it wasn't until I moved out of California as an adult that I didn't really think of myself as the other, because I had a diverse friend group. And it wasn't until I moved that, and people were like, what are you? Or, wow, you speak English really well. That I was like, what are these people talking about? And so I felt like, I think Huda said, you know, she tells one Muslim American story, and I'm telling one Japanese American story. This is more like how I grew up. And it's not all Japanese Americans are Jasmine Taguchi. So I just feel really grateful that I got to write these stories over 8 books and got to tell this Jasmine story over and over. And I want to add on to what Kirk and Huda were saying, that Jasmine is not me, but there are pieces of me. And in fact, at a recent school visit, somebody said, are you like, which character are you most like in the Jasmine story? And Jasmine has a mean older sister named Sophie, who's just mean to her. And I said, ooh, I'm like Sophie. And the way the kids gasped, you would have thought I said, I'm a murderer, you know, and because I am the older sister. So in every book, there's a piece of me in many of the characters. I'm not any of the characters. In fact, Jasmine's more loosely based on my daughter, who's very confident and outspoken and outgoing and independent. And I was not that person in 3rd grade. So yeah, that's, yep.
Thank you, Debbie. I just want to remind our audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in chat, because I know we are coming up on time. And I do want to mention that in chat, Nancy actually posted that she is from Jacksonville, North Carolina, and they just wrapped up their monthly graphic novel book club, and their latest read was Huda F. Are You? So. And they really think that your book resonates with everyone. So anybody else, if you have questions or comments, put them in chat. So I want to move on to what is coming up next for everybody. Some of you have alluded to that already, but let's go ahead. Kirk, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, well, next up here, I showed this when we were in the green room, but the next Duck and Moose book is coming out on December 3rd. I just wrapped up the final art for it. And it is about how Duck is definitely, absolutely, totally not afraid of the dark. And, you know, in Denali, which he hasn't gotten used to yet, it gets dark really early for a long time. And so he has to, he's got to learn how to deal. And he may or may not deal with it very well.
All right, terrific. Debbie.
Oh, I have my first middle grade series coming out in March. On March 11th, book 1 of the Last Chance Academy series is called A Study in Secrets. And my publishers are calling it Only Murders in the Building meets The Escape from Mr. Lemoncello's Library. And it's 12-year-old Japanese American girl loses her mom and starts doing poorly in school. So her dad wants to be helpful and sends her off to an exclusive boarding school. And all she wants is to go home until these mysterious silver envelopes are slid under all the dorm room doors, inviting them to take part in a secret mysterious treasure hunt. And the prize is something she believes will get her to go home and reunite with her dad. So that's why she decides to participate. And there are secret rooms and secrets to uncover, and it becomes very apparent that this treasure hunt is not quite what these students think it is.
That sounds so
Terrific. Cool. Yes. Huda?
I think I showed it, but here it is. Huda F Wants to Know is the 3rd installment in the Huda F series, and this one is a it is a divorce story, and her parents are getting divorced, and Huda has to process that grief, and it's we were joking before, but the Huda F. Cares is a really happy kind of like family is so important, and then this one's kind of like a really big shock to her in the very first couple pages when it's revealed to her. So that will be out April 1st. It is not an April Fool's joke. That is April 1st, 2025. And I'm so excited. I can't wait for everyone to read it.
Terrific. Pedro, how about you?
See those little post-it notes behind me? That's what I'm working on. No, we're past that, but I just am too lazy to take the post-it notes down. I am working on Mexican too. We're in the drafts, the second drafts right now, so I'm just waiting for our lovely editor Kate Harrison to kick it back to me and make me cry. So it's basically it's a sequel to Mexikid. It's our family. You get to see us in our element in the strawberry fields of Central California, picking strawberries and as sharecroppers. And my dad at some point in the story decides that he's going to let us leave the field. We can leave the fields if we want to, but we have to explain what we're going to do if we leave the fields. We have to have a plan. And so it's the story about everybody kind of picking their routes and deciding what they're going to be if they leave the fields. And so it's more my story of me trying to figure that out for myself and going through a bunch of kind of hoops and stuff in my mind of how I'm going to figure something out that's going to save me from the fields. So it's kind of the story about the farmer, and it's a lot of story about immigration and how we are seen as the other. And so it's a lot of good stuff. It's very funny stuff, and hopefully it'll be an enjoyable ride.
Terrific. And I always love to ask our authors, what are you reading right now? So Huda, let's start with you.
I am a judge for the National Book Award this year, and so about 350 books, a little more maybe. I'm reading a lot. I don't even know if I can tell you what I'm reading, to be honest. It's I got a lot of great books out this year. Let me think. Oh man, I really don't know what I'm just gonna say. Great books out there. I don't know what more I can say. Great books out there. I can't say more because I actually signed an NDA, but
it's a good answer. NDA. I don't know.
A lot of great books out there.
Yeah, and with many of our audience, I'm sure if anybody has served on a book committee at one time or another, we definitely understand that answer and can't remember them anyway because they all sort of blend together after a while.
They do.
Yeah. Debbie, how about you?
I am reading an arc that I'm supposed to blurb. It is called No Purchase Necessary by Maria Marinayagan, about a Sri Lankan boy who is coerced by a bully to steal a candy bar and has the winning ticket for $1 million in it. And now he's got to figure out how he can spin. He ends up spinning a lot of lies. It's hilarious and very heartfelt, and I'm almost finished with it, and I'm loving it. I believe that this comes out next year.
Terrific. Kirk, how about you?
Okay, I've got two. One is out of my reach, but it is my good buddy Scout Underhill's graphic novel D&Doggos. So their book just came out this year. If you like D&D and adventure and humor and really adorable dogs, it is the book for you. And they came up with a one-shot RPG too, so that you can download that for free. So if any of our librarians are looking for an afternoon program with an easy to get into role-playing game, that's excellent. And it's I got to see really early versions of it, and so it's been a real treat to actually see the finished version of the book. And the other thing I'm reading is People, Play, and Purpose by Margaret Chandra Carrison. So Margaret was an Imagineer, and she worked on like the environmental narrative for like the Star Wars theme park and stuff like that. So if anyone is interested in experience design or like making escape rooms and things like that, her books are excellent, excellent reads.
Terrific. Thank you, Kirk. All of our programming librarians are like scribbling
Yeah.
stuff down.
Yeah, I have my notebook. Like, that sounds good.
Pedro, what are you reading?
I just finished, and this isn't for kids, so I apologize, but this is Ducks. This is Kate Beaton's book, which I just loved. And I was, first of all, thing one, whoever designed this cover designed it so that it feels like sand. So it's like it's about the sand tars, the tar fields up there in Canada, and it's about her 2 years up there amongst misogyny and cold, and there's just the artwork is just bananas. I just loved it. And a friend of mine recommended it to me, and then he said I stopped reading it because it was affecting my work so much that he's like, I started writing like her. So he's like, I had to put it down, and I'm like, all the more reason for me to pick it up. I needed help. So yeah, this was the best thing ever. But yeah, so I really enjoy it. And yeah, not for kids, it's YA, but if you ever get a chance to pick it up, it's worth it.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us today and talking about your work and your lives and books, because that's what we're here for. And I'm going to turn it back over to Stephanie.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you all again. So thank you, Debbie, Pedro, Kirk, and Huda. This was such a fun conversation. I like little tangents that was like, what's the question again? It was just great. And such great comments in the chat too. I know everyone's looking forward to all your new books, your new projects. So thank you again. And thank you, Christy, for a lovely job moderating, as
Yay,
always.
Christy.
Thank
Yay.
you.
Good job.
Yes.
Yay.
Definitely round of applause. Yes, and thank you again. We're so happy to have you.
All right. It's great talking to everybody too. Thank you,
Yes, this was
everyone.
fun.
you.
Thank
Thank you. It
you.
was such
Have
a
a good day.
pleasure.